At 11:23 in the morning, a voice came through on the radio at base camp. It was calm, measured, the kind of voice a man uses when nothing is wrong. I'm sitting the East Ridge, seeing some movement above the draw, going to hold here a while, back for lunch. That was it. 31 words, a routine check-in, the kind of transmission that passes between hunting partners dozens of times across a long season and is forgotten by the time the coffee goes cold. Except this one wasn't forgotten. Because 6 hours later, when the light had fallen and the temperature was dropping, and that voice still had not come back to camp, investigators would replay those 31 words over and over, trying to find something in them, some indication, some clue, some detail that might explain what happened next. They never found it, or they couldn't agree on whether they had. That radio call, made at 11:23 a.m. on November 9th, from somewhere on the east ridge of a mountain in north-central Montana, is the last confirmed communication from Thomas Gant. He was 56 years old. He had been hunting these mountains for more than 2 decades. He knew the East Ridge the way most people know the route from their front door to the end of their driveway. He did not come back for lunch. He did not come back at all. And that 31-word transmission, so ordinary that the man who received it almost didn't note the time, would become the centerpiece of one of the most carefully examined missing persons investigations that Mineral County, Montana had ever conducted. What Thomas Gant said was documented. What he meant was not. And where he was when he said it turned out to be a question that 5 years of investigation has not been able to answer with certainty. Let's start with what we know about Thomas Gant before that morning. Because in cases like this, understanding who a person is matters. Thomas had grown up in western Montana, the son of a rancher who had taught him to hunt elk in the same general country he would disappear in decades later. By his mid-30s, he had developed what his hunting partners described as a systematic approach to the mountains, not a casual, instinct-driven style of hunting, but something closer to an applied study of the landscape. He kept detailed notes on game movement, weather patterns, and seasonal changes in specific terrain features. His notebooks, which investigators examined thoroughly, span more than 20 years and cover multiple drainage systems in the Mineral County region. He was a retired civil engineer. His professional instincts showed in how he approached the mountain. He thought in terms of systems and variables. He didn't guess. He observed, drew conclusions, and tested them against what the next season produced. His hunting partner of 9 years, a man named Kevin Hoser, told investigators that Thomas was the kind of hunter who was almost never in the wrong place at the wrong time. Kevin said that in 9 years of hunting together, he could not recall Thomas ever making a significant navigational error or arriving at a stand location to find the conditions wrong for the reason he was there. Kevin described Thomas as someone who had, over 2 decades, essentially mastered the East Ridge, which is why the radio call matters. Because when Thomas said he was on the East Ridge, seeing movement above the draw, Kevin did not question it. It was exactly where Thomas would be. It was exactly what Thomas would say. Everything about that transmission was consistent with a man who was doing what he always did, in a place he knew as well as any place on Earth. And that consistency is part of why the call became so difficult to interpret later. Was it a normal check-in from a man who was fine and then was not? Or were there details in those 31 words that pointed towards something that had already begun to go wrong? Investigators spent months trying to answer that. We're going to spend some time with it too. Kevin Hoser received the 11:23 transmission at base camp. He was the only one there. The third member of their group, a man named Dale Prentice, was hunting the west side of the same mountain, out of radio range of base camp. Kevin had stayed at camp that morning because of a knee that had been giving him problems. He had planned to hike up to a glassing point in the afternoon, but wanted to rest the knee through the morning hours. He heard Thomas's call come through clearly. No static, no broken transmission. The signal was strong. This is the first detail that investigators focused on. Strong radio signal from the East Ridge. The East Ridge of that specific mountain had known radio dead zones, sections where the terrain geometry blocked transmission to and from the base camp location. Kevin knew them. Thomas knew them. They were features of the landscape that both men had encountered and worked around over years of hunting together. A strong, clean transmission from the East Ridge meant Thomas was calling from one of the positions where signal was reliable. There were 4 such positions on the East Ridge, documented in Kevin's knowledge of the terrain, and later mapped by investigators using signal testing equipment. The positions were not evenly distributed. They were specific points where the ridge geometry opened up enough for transmission to travel unobstructed to the valley where base camp sat. Thomas's transmission was strong enough that Kevin didn't have to ask him to repeat anything. Investigators used this to narrow the geographic range of where Thomas could have been when he made the call. If he was on the East Ridge, and if the signal was strong, he was at one of 4 known transmission points. Those 4 points were later mapped and confirmed. The investigation from that point forward was shaped by the question of which of the 4 Thomas had been at. And that question, despite the investigation's best efforts, has never been definitively answered. Now let's talk about the 31 words themselves, because investigators did not just listen to them, they analyzed them. I'm sitting the East Ridge, seeing some movement above the draw. Going to hold here a while, back for lunch. The first sentence establishes location. East Ridge. Consistent with Thomas's stated plan for the day, which Kevin confirmed Thomas had outlined the previous evening at camp. Nothing unusual. The second sentence, seeing some movement above the draw, is where investigators spent the most time. Which draw? The East Ridge of that mountain has 2 significant drainage features that hunters typically refer to as draws. A northern draw that runs toward the upper elevation timber, and a southern draw that angles down toward a creek drainage about 1.5 miles below the ridge. Both are features Thomas had hunted in multiple seasons. Both were referenced in his notebooks. Kevin assumed Thomas meant the northern draw. That was the feature Thomas typically worked from the upper ridge positions. When Kevin gave his initial statement to investigators, he said without hesitation that Thomas meant the northern draw. But Dale Prentice, when he came back into radio range and was informed of Thomas's call, had a different interpretation. Dale had hunted with Thomas for 4 of the 9 years Kevin had. He said Thomas almost always said the draw when referring to the southern feature, that he distinguished the 2 by calling the northern one the upper draw and the southern one simply the draw. Kevin disputed this. He said Thomas used the terms interchangeably. That disagreement between two men who knew Thomas well about a single phrase in a 31-word transmission would shape the entire early phase of the search. It sent resources in different directions based on different interpretations of where Thomas had been. It was the first contradiction. It would not be the last. At 2 p.m., Kevin attempted a radio check with Thomas. No response. He tried again at 2:30. Still nothing. He was not immediately alarmed. The East Ridge had dead zones, and if Thomas had moved from his position at the draw to follow the game movement he'd mentioned, or to work a different part of the ridge, he might simply be in terrain where radio contact wasn't possible. At 3:15, Dale Prentice arrived back at base camp from the western side of the mountain. Kevin told him about the 11:23 call. Dale tried the radio himself. No response. At 4 o'clock, with the light starting to angle low and the temperature dropping, they agreed to give it until 4:30 before doing anything more. Thomas had said back for lunch. Lunch had come and gone, but Thomas occasionally lost track of times the field. Not habitually, Kevin was careful to say, but it had happened. At 4:30, Kevin tried the radio again. Nothing. At 4:45, Dale drove the access road to the trailhead. He called out. He listened. He came back to camp. At 5:30, as the last light left the sky, Kevin Hoser called Mineral County Search and Rescue. He told the coordinator who answered that his hunting partner had made a radio call from the East Ridge at 11:23 that morning and had not returned to camp. He said Thomas's last words were that he would be back for lunch. The coordinator noted the time of the call, the location, and one additional detail that Kevin mentioned almost as an afterthought. He said his voice was completely normal. There was nothing in it. That description, nothing in it, is in the official case file. And it is, in retrospect, one of the most analyzed phrases in the entire investigation, because it raises a question that has no clean answer. Was Thomas's calm voice the voice of a man who had no reason to be anything other than calm? Or was it the voice of a man who was already in a situation that would shortly become critical, and who gave no indication of it? Let me tell you what the East Ridge looked like when search teams arrived in the dark. The access trail to the East Ridge is approximately 2 miles from the trailhead. The ridge itself runs roughly north to south for about 1.5 miles before it begins to drop steeply into the drainage below. The elevation at the ridge is just under 7,000 feet. In November, the nights are severe. Temperatures regularly fall below zero, with wind chill on the exposed upper sections. The terrain is mixed. Open rocky sections alternate with stands of lodgepole and subalpine fir. The southern draw that Dale and Kevin had disagreed about is a feature of the lower ridge, where the slope angles off toward the creek drainage. The northern draw is a shallower feature, more of a bench than a true drainage, where animals cross between the upper timber and the lower meadow. Search coordinator Lisa Farrell later said in her incident report that the East Ridge presented 2 specific challenges for the initial search. The first was the terrain itself. Rocky, uneven, with sections of loose talus on the upper third that made night movement dangerous for searchers. The second was the disagreement about the draw. Because Kevin and Dale couldn't agree on which draw Thomas meant, the initial search split resources between 2 areas that were separated by roughly 3/4 of a mile of ridge terrain, Teams searched the vicinity of both draws simultaneously, in the dark, in dropping temperatures. Neither team found anything on night 1. Not a boot print, not a discarded food wrapper, not a piece of clothing. Thomas Gant had been on that ridge for most of a day, and the first search produced no physical trace of his presence at any point. Dawn brought more searchers. By 8 in the morning, 60 volunteers were on the mountain. Dogs were en route from a facility in Missoula, expected by midday. The search coordinator expanded the grid. The East Ridge was divided into sections and assigned systematically. And then the first anomaly of the search appeared, in a specific section of the eastern upper ridge, roughly consistent with the area where one of the 4 known transmission points was located. The search team found a clear boot print in a small patch of exposed soil between 2 rock slabs. One boot print, left foot, partial impression, but enough tread pattern to be analyzed. The print was photographed, measured, and compared against a boot recovered from Thomas's camp. The tread pattern was consistent. The size was consistent. One boot print in the right area, pointing south toward the southern draw. Whether that print was Thomas's could not be confirmed conclusively. The terrain was used by hunters across the season, and the print had no datable feature that could establish when it was made. But it was there, and it pointed south, toward the draw that Dale had said Thomas typically called the draw, and away from the area Kevin had initially led the search toward. The dogs arrived at noon on day 2. They were given scent material from Thomas's camp, clothing, gear, items handled only by Thomas, and deployed at the trailhead. They tracked well up the access trail and onto the East Ridge without difficulty. The scent was clear and strong along the approach route, consistent with Thomas having walked it in the pre-dawn hours of November 9th. The dogs reached the upper ridge and began working the area near the known transmission points. At the 3rd transmission point, a rocky promontory on the upper east face, the one with the longest line of sight toward base camp, the dogs showed strong interest. They worked the area carefully. The handlers gave them time. Then they turned south, following the ridge toward the southern draw. The handlers let the dogs work. The dogs moved south along the ridge for approximately a half-mile before the scent began to degrade. The handlers attributed this partly to the wind. It had come up significantly since the previous day, and wind disrupts scent in rocky, open terrain. The dogs worked the southern draw approach. The scent was inconsistent, present in some sections, absent in others. The handlers concluded that the wind had scattered the scent trail in a way that made continuous tracking impossible. What they could establish with reasonable confidence was that Thomas Gant had been at or near the 3rd transmission point on the upper East Ridge, and that his scent, such as it could be followed, moved south along the ridge toward the southern draw. Whether he reached the draw or stopped short of it, or went past it and into the lower drainage, the dogs could not establish with certainty. The search expanded into the lower drainage. Teams worked the creek bottom and the timber above it. Nothing. Day 3 produced the first significant physical evidence beyond the boot print. A search team working the southern draw, the area Dale had insisted Thomas meant, found Thomas's rifle. It was on the ground, not propped, not placed. On the ground, in the brush at the edge of the draw, in a position consistent with having been set down or dropped. The barrel was pointing downhill, The safety was on. The serial number confirmed it was Thomas's. The rifle had not been fired. Investigators processed the area around the rifle carefully. No blood. No disturbance in the vegetation consistent with a fall or a struggle. No other items in the immediate vicinity. The rifle's condition raised an immediate question. Thomas Gant was an experienced hunter who had carried that rifle in these mountains for more than a decade. He was meticulous about his equipment. Kevin Hoser told investigators he had never seen Thomas set his rifle on the ground in the field. Not while resting, not while glassing, not while eating or adjusting gear. Thomas always either carried it or leaned it carefully against something. A rifle on the ground, safety on, in a brushy draw. That was not consistent with anything Kevin knew about how Thomas handled his equipment. But the rifle hadn't been fired. There was no blood. There was no sign of any violent or sudden event. So what had happened that led to Thomas's rifle being on the ground in the southern draw? Investigators had no answer. But day 3 had one more discovery that pushed the question into new territory. A volunteer searcher working the lower edge of the draw found a partial boot print in the soft soil at the draw's lower margin, the point where the feature begins to flatten into the creek drainage below. The impression was partial, less than half a print. But the tread pattern was consistent with Thomas's boot. The rifle was at the upper edge of the draw. The partial print was at the lower edge. Something had moved through that draw from top to bottom. Something that left a rifle at one end and a footprint at the other. And nothing in between. Let's talk about what those physical discoveries created, in terms of the investigation's understanding of Thomas's last known movements. The transmission point, established by the dogs, was at the Upper East Ridge, approximately at the third of the 4 known signal positions. From that point, the scent and the boot print and eventually the rifle all indicated movement south along the ridge and then into the southern draw. The rifle was at the upper margin of the draw. The footprint was at the lower margin. Below the lower margin of the draw was the creek drainage, a feature running east to west along the base of the mountain, roughly 700 feet below the ridge. Investigators built a movement timeline from those data points. Thomas had been at the transmission point at approximately 11:23. He had then moved south. At some unknown time, he had entered the southern draw from the upper ridge. He had moved through the draw to its lower margin. And then there was nothing. No additional footprints, no more scent, no gear. Whatever Thomas had done after reaching the lower edge of that draw, he had left no recoverable trace of it. The creek drainage was searched extensively. Over the following 3 days, teams walked both banks for more than a mile in each direction from the point below the draw. The creek itself was walked by searchers, wading through it, in sections where the bottom was muddy enough to potentially hold impressions. Nothing. The search coordinator would later say in her summary report that the evidence established Thomas's presence at a series of points on the East Ridge and Southern Draw. It established a direction of movement, down through the draw toward the drainage. It did not establish what happened once he reached the drainage, or where he went from there, or why. She wrote that the investigation had produced, in her experience, an unusually clean trail of evidence pointing to a specific location, the lower margin of the southern draw, and then an unusually complete absence of evidence from that point forward. Her word was clean. The trail was clean. And then it ended. Now let's go back to the radio call, because even with the physical evidence establishing Thomas's movement through the draw, a fundamental question about the transmission had not been resolved. In some ways, the physical evidence made it more acute. Seeing some movement above the draw, going to hold here a while. If Thomas was at the transmission point on the Upper East Ridge, which the dogs established with reasonable confidence, and if he was looking at movement above the draw, which draw was he watching? The physical evidence placed Thomas in and through the southern draw later in the day. His rifle was there. His footprint was there. But the transmission said he was watching movement above the draw, not that he was entering it. He was sitting, observing, planning to hold his position. Something changed between 11:23 and the moment he entered that draw. Whatever he had been watching, the movement he described, had done something that caused him to leave his position and move south. Did he follow an animal into the draw? Possible. He had fired his rifle. No, wait. The rifle wasn't fired. He had not shot anything. He had watched movement above the draw, held his position, and at some point moved south, into the draw, through it, and toward the drainage, without firing, without calling Kevin on the radio to report a shot, without any communication of any kind after 11:23. A man who checked in reliably, who had a strong radio signal from his position, who planned to be back for lunch, went silent for 6 hours and ended up a mile from where he'd been, in a drainage, with his rifle on the ground, and left a no explanation. Investigators took another look at the transmission in the second month of the investigation. This time, they focused not on what Thomas said, but on a technical aspect of the call that had not been analyzed in the initial phase. The radio system the hunting group used logged signal strength data automatically. This was a feature neither Kevin nor Thomas had specifically utilized. It was a built-in function of the model they used, and the data was stored on the base camp unit. When investigators extracted this data and had it analyzed by a radio technician, a specific detail emerged. The transmission at 11:23 had come in at strong signal, consistent with one of the 4 known transmission points. But the signal strength analysis indicated a particular signal pattern that the technician said was most consistent with the 3rd transmission point, the rocky promontory on the upper east face. This was significant because it aligned with where the dogs had shown strong interest. But the technician added a qualification that investigators found worth noting. He said the signal pattern was most consistent with the 3rd point, but that under certain atmospheric conditions, specifically during temperature inversions, which can occur in mountain terrain in November, the signal could behave in ways that made source location less reliable. He said his analysis put the transmission at the 3rd point with roughly 70% confidence, 30% uncertainty, 30% chance that Thomas was somewhere else on the East Ridge when he made that call. The investigation had been built substantially on the 70% interpretation. The search had concentrated resources in the areas consistent with the 3rd transmission point. The 30%, the question of whether Thomas might have been somewhere else entirely when he spoke those 31 words, remained an open question that no one had a way to close. Let's talk about the missing hours from 11:23 a.m. when Thomas made the call to the moment his rifle was found at the upper margin of the southern draw on day 3. Some unknown amount of time elapsed. The rifle was found on day 3 of the search, not day 1. That meant the terrain around the rifle had already been searched, at least partially before the rifle was located. The search coordinator's log shows that a team had walked the southern draw on the afternoon of day 1 in the dark, without finding the rifle. Investigators considered 2 possible explanations for this. The first was that the draw search on night 1 had been incomplete. Teams were moving fast, in darkness, in deteriorating conditions, and may have missed the rifle. The second was that the rifle wasn't in the draw on night 1. If the rifle was not there on night 1, it had been placed there between the night 1 search and the day 3 discovery. Who or what would have done that? Investigators examined the possibility that another person had moved the rifle. This was never confirmed, never established, and ultimately left as a consideration rather than a conclusion. There was no evidence of another person's presence in the draw area during the relevant period. But absence of evidence, in that terrain and in those conditions, was acknowledged as an incomplete answer. The more likely explanation, the one the search coordinator favored, was that the night 1 draw search had been incomplete. Dark, cold, difficult terrain, moving quickly, the rifle could have been missed, but the coordinator noted it as an uncertainty. And uncertainties in a case file have a way of accumulating. The final missing hours question is the one that investigators returned to repeatedly and never resolved. What did Thomas Gant do between approximately 11:23 a.m. and the point at which he entered the southern draw? Even if we place him at the transmission point at 11:23, watching movement above the draw and planning to hold his position, at some point in the following hours he moved. He moved south along the ridge. He entered the draw. The draw is roughly a mile from the transmission point. A person moving at a moderate pace could cover that distance in 30 to 45 minutes. If Thomas entered the draw at noon, he had an hour and a half of unaccounted activity before that. If he entered at 2, he had more than 2 hours. The ground between the transmission point and the upper margin of the draw was searched carefully on day 2. No additional evidence was found in that corridor. No boot prints, no discarded items, no indication of what Thomas was doing in the time between his call and his arrival at the draw. He could have stayed at his position, observing the movement he'd mentioned, before deciding to pursue. He could have moved north first, and then south. He could have done something else entirely in the hours between 11:23 and his arrival at the draw. The physical evidence doesn't say. The radio call doesn't say. Kevin and Dale don't know. And Thomas has not been found to tell anyone. Let's examine the theories that investigators formally considered. The most straightforward. Thomas fell in the draw, was injured, succumbed to exposure overnight. The temperatures on November 9th dropped to 4 degrees. A person injured and unable to move would not survive the night. This theory is consistent with the physical evidence in the sense that it places Thomas in the draw area near the end of his documented movement. But it doesn't explain why the search of the draw and the drainage below it, conducted extensively over multiple days, produced nothing. A person who falls and stays down is found, especially with a clear reference point like the rifle location. The search coordinator was careful in her report not to say Thomas was not in the draw area. She said that searches of the area had produced no confirmation that Thomas was there. That distinction, no confirmation versus no presence, is the distinction that keeps the case open. The second theory: Thomas made it to the drainage and followed the creek. The drainage runs east toward lower terrain and eventually toward a secondary road several miles from the hunting area. A person following a drainage is typically following it downhill, the natural direction of travel for someone who is disoriented, injured, or simply trying to find a way out. If Thomas followed the drainage, he would have traveled away from the area searched most intensively. The secondary road at the drainage's eastern terminus was checked. No sign of Thomas. No one on that road during the relevant period reported seeing anyone on foot. The drainage itself was searched to the point where it became a lower elevation valley creek, accessible by vehicle. Nothing was found. The third theory, and the one that investigators acknowledged, was the least satisfying, but the most honest. Thomas is somewhere in that terrain that searches have not adequately covered. Mountain search is not perfect. Terrain creates gaps. Conditions affect outcomes. The East Ridge and its drainage have sections of boulder field and dense timber that are genuinely difficult to search thoroughly. The coordinator's summary acknowledged that full saturation coverage of the area had not been achieved. If Thomas is in an unsearched or inadequately searched section of that terrain, he has not been found because searchers have not reached him. That's not a satisfying explanation. It doesn't say anything about what happened to him, but it acknowledges a real limitation. There is one additional detail in this case that investigators raised in the cold case review conducted 2 years after Thomas's disappearance. It concerns the movement Thomas described in the radio call, seeing some movement above the draw. Investigators had focused on the draw, on which draw Thomas meant, and on his subsequent movement into it. But the cold case reviewer flagged the phrase "above the draw" for a different reason. If Thomas was at the transmission point on the Upper East Ridge, and he was watching movement above the draw, the movement he was describing would have been at or above his elevation, not below him, not in the draw itself. Above. The reviewer noted that most game movement in that terrain, in November, runs from the upper timber downhill to the lower meadows as animals move toward winter range. Movement above the draw, meaning movement at or above Thomas's position on the upper ridge, would be counter to the typical pattern. Not impossible, but unusual enough that the reviewer flagged it. What was moving above the draw at 11:23 on November 9th? Thomas didn't say. He said he was holding his position to watch it. He never called back to say what it was. He never called back at all. Let's look at 2 other cases, because Thomas Gant's disappearance, while specific in its details, shares structural features with documented investigations that deserve comparison. The first involves a hunter named Warren Bliss, who disappeared in the Kootenai National Forest of northwestern Montana in October of 2007. Warren was 61 years old. He was hunting elk with his son and 2 other men. At approximately 10 in the morning, he made radio contact with his son to confirm his position and his plan. The call was normal. He said he intended to work a ridgeline east of their camp, He was never heard from again. His son, who received that final call the way Kevin Hoser had received Thomas's, later told investigators that the call had been completely ordinary. No stress, no urgency, no indication of any problem. Searchers worked the Kootenai Ridgeline for 9 days. Warren Bliss was never found. His rifle was eventually located on day 4 in a creek drainage below the ridgeline he had intended to hunt, in a position that investigators described as having been placed rather than dropped. 2 hunters, 2 final radio calls, both described as normal. Both rifles found in drainage areas below their intended positions. Both men gone. The second case involves a hunter named Patrick Dolan, 53 years old, who disappeared from a hunting unit in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana in November of 2014. Patrick had checked in by radio with his brother at approximately 1 in the afternoon. The call was brief and normal. He said he was moving to a new position. The radio call from Patrick Dolan was the last communication his family received. His brother later told investigators something that has appeared in multiple family accounts of similar cases. He said, "If I'd known that was the last call, I would have listened differently. I would have listened for something. But there was nothing to hear. It was completely normal. Nothing to hear. Thomas Gant's call was described the same way. Warren Bliss's call, the same way. Patrick Dolan's call, the same way. All normal. All final. All completely unremarkable transmissions from men who were about to vanish. Which brings us back, always, to the question. What does normal sound like when something has already gone wrong? And if it sounds the same as normal when nothing is wrong, how would anyone know? Kevin Hoser has given 2 on-record interviews about Thomas's disappearance. The first was shortly after the case went cold. The second was the year after, when the cold case review was completed. In both interviews, Kevin returned to the radio call. He said that in the months after Thomas disappeared, he replayed the 11:23 transmission in his memory hundreds of times. He tried to find something in it, a hesitation, a word choice that meant something he hadn't understood at the time, a background sound that might indicate where Thomas was or what was around him. He found nothing. The call was what it appeared to be. 31 words from a man who was fine. But Kevin said something in the second interview that the journalist noted as unusual. He said he had stopped trying to find something wrong with the call. He said he had started, instead, to think about whether the call was trying to tell him something that he simply didn't have the context to receive. He said Thomas was a systematic man, an engineer, a person who said what he meant and meant what he said. And what Thomas said was, "I'm here. I'm seeing this. I'm holding." Kevin said he had come to believe that those 31 words were accurate, that Thomas was telling the truth about where he was, what he saw, and what he planned to do, which meant that whatever happened to Thomas happened after the call, not before, not during, after. Something changed on that ridge, sometime after 11:23 in the morning, and Kevin Hoser, who knew Thomas Gant for 9 years, who hunted with him in those mountains in every season, who received the last 31 words Thomas ever transmitted. Kevin does not know what it was. He said, "He told me he'd be back for lunch. Thomas didn't say things he didn't mean." So somewhere between that call and lunchtime, something happened that made it impossible for him to keep his word. And I have spent 5 years trying to figure out what that was. He paused. I still don't know. The Mineral County Sheriff's Office has confirmed that Thomas Gant's case remains an open missing persons investigation. The case file includes the signal strength analysis, the search reports, the comparison of the northern and southern draw interpretations, the documentation of the boot print and the rifle, and the cold case review conducted by an outside investigator. The cold case reviewer's summary concludes with a section titled Outstanding Questions. It lists 7. The first: which of the 4 transmission points was Thomas at when he made the 11:23 call? The second: which draw was Thomas observing when he described movement above it? The third: what caused Thomas to move from his observation position into the southern draw? The fourth: what was Thomas doing in the period between 11:23 and his arrival at the draw? The fifth: why did Thomas enter the draw without calling Kevin on the radio? The sixth: was the rifle in the draw when search teams walked it on night 1, or was it placed there later? The seventh: where is Thomas Gant? 7 questions. 5 years of investigation. A case file that documents what the evidence established and is honest about what it did not. The reviewer wrote in his closing paragraph, "The investigation conducted by Mineral County, Search and Rescue, and cooperating agencies was thorough and professional. The outcomes of that investigation do not reflect any failure of investigative method. They reflect the nature of the evidence itself, which established a partial record of the subject's movements and did not yield a complete account of what occurred. A partial record. That's what 5 years of work produced. A partial record of a man who made a radio call at 11:23 in the morning, said he was watching movement above a draw, said he planned to hold his position, said he would be back for lunch, and then was gone. Thomas Gant's notebooks are still in Kevin Hoser's possession. Kevin asked the family if he could keep them after the investigation concluded, and the family agreed. The notebooks cover more than 20 years. They document game patterns, weather observations, terrain notes, and the seasonal rhythms of the East Ridge, in a level of detail that reflects a man who paid close attention to the world around him. Kevin has read through them several times in the years since Thomas disappeared. He has been looking, he said, for any reference to the southern draw, to the transmission points on the ridge, to any notation that might indicate what Thomas knew about that specific terrain feature that Kevin didn't know. He hasn't found anything that changes the picture, but he told the journalist in his second interview that he found something else in the notebooks. He said Thomas had written, in the margin of an entry from 3 seasons before his disappearance, a single observation about the East Ridge that Kevin had never heard Thomas mention in conversation. It was a note about movement, about game moving in a direction and at a time that Thomas couldn't explain within his usual framework for understanding what animals did in that terrain. The note said, in Thomas's precise engineer's handwriting, movement above upper draw, late morning, counter to pattern, source not identified. Kevin said he stared at that note for a long time. Late morning, movement above the draw, counter to pattern, source not identified. 3 seasons before Thomas's disappearance, he had seen something on the East Ridge that he couldn't explain. On November 9th, in his last radio call, he reported seeing movement above the draw again. He said he was going to hold his position and watch it. Whether what he saw on November 9th was related to what he had noted 3 seasons earlier is unknowable. Whether it matters at all is unknowable. Kevin Hoser doesn't know what to make of it. Neither do investigators. Neither do we. The last radio call from the forest came in at 11:23. 31 words. Strong signal. A man's voice saying nothing unusual. The East Ridge is still there. The southern draw is still there. The creek drainage still runs east through the valley below the mountain. Every fall, hunters park at the same trailhead and walk the same access trail toward the same ridge. They glass the same meadows. They sit in the same timber. None of them have found Thomas Gant. The Mineral County Sheriff's Office is still accepting information from anyone who was in the East Ridge hunting unit on November 9th or the surrounding days and has anything to report. His family is still waiting, and Kevin Hoser still has the radio. He told the journalist that he has not turned it off since the day Thomas disappeared. He knows that's not rational. He knows that after 5 years, another transmission is not coming. But he keeps the radio on. He said, "Every morning when I turn it on, I hear what that channel sounds like when it's quiet. And I hear what it sounded like when Thomas called. And I think about what it means that those two things, the silence and the call, end up in the same place." He said, "I don't have an answer for that." Thomas Gant called in at 11:23. He said he was fine. He said he would be back. The channel has been quiet ever since. What happened in the hours between that call and the silence is the question that 5 years of investigation, 7 outstanding findings, and one engineer's 20-year notebook full of careful observations have not been able to answer. What did Thomas Gant see above that draw? And why, after watching it, did he follow it into the mountain and not come back?